So, it's my great pleasure to welcome two friends and colleagues who are going to join me in this dialogue session. And I'll ask them to come up in turn in the order in which they're going to speak. So, first, Peter Linett, who's a friend and colleague from the world of cultural research. Peter is a partner in Slover Linett Research based in Chicago. Peter, come sit down, please. And he's also the founder of an intriguing resource for the cultural sector called Kettle. You can sort of imagine what that might be, brewing interesting innovations in public engagement. So I'm especially pleased that Peter's with us today. Secondly, Andrea Bandelli, known to many of you, I'm sure. Andrea has been in the field of science centers for many years and in many roles. He's been a consultant, and I've worked with him in the past on a number of different projects. He's more recently been completing a PhD at the Free University of Amsterdam on the role of science centers in developing science citizenship. And many of you will know that he's currently the CEO of Science Gallery International. So welcome, Andrea. Now, we are supposed to be informal in this most formal of spaces. So you're going to, I hope, bear with us. Also, we have some technology that is not entirely familiar to me, so I'm going to pretend that I'm in my living room, and you pretend that you're with me in my living room, and we'll see how we get on. The way we want to make this work is that the three of us are going to each speak in turn for no more than 10 minutes. We'll have a short exchange amongst ourselves about what we each have said, but then we're going to throw it open very much to all of you. And as I say, when we do that, we're going to invite you to just deliberate briefly at your tables and come up with a question for the field, for the sector, that you think is most interesting to present as a contribution to this discussion. So I'm assuming that you're seeing what I'm seeing. So our theme is, what does public engagement, in quotes, mean today? So here's just a little, I hope, provocative starter for 10, as they say. Once upon a time, I'm afraid it's a time that I can personally remember, that doesn't necessarily fill me with joy, there was a field known to many people as the public understanding of science. It came to be seen, I think with only partial justice, as a field dominated by one-way communication, science communicators with metaphorical loud-hailers, trying to get people out there to pay attention, listen, and learn. And that kind of activity came to be critiqued in one of the most famous critiques in our field, under the pejorative label, the deficit model. The idea being, as we all know, that this kind of communication was based on the assumption that scientists and science communicators are the people who know, and audiences are the people who don't know, and it was a matter of shipping the information from the one to the other. That is what the old public understanding of science came to be seen as, and the whole characterization I've just briefly described here was a critique by people who wanted this to be something else. So there was a very strong thumbs down to that way of doing things, particularly, I would say, in the late 1990s. I was involved myself in a report produced by the House of Lords in the UK in 2000, which was constructed entirely around a critique of that kind of thing. What was put in its place was meant to be something radically new and different. It was not meant to be based on one-way communication. It was based on listening, even if, as apparently here, reluctantly. Listening as well as speaking. It was meant to be about at least two-way or multi-way communication. It was built around something that came to be known as the dialogue model, rather than the deficit model. And it gave rise to a new phrase for the field. Instead of public understanding of science, it was now to be public engagement with science, which is our title this afternoon. And I can remember very distinctly the point at which it became really impossible, not least to raise money for a project in our field, if you call it a project in the public understanding of science. Funders just would not recognize it. And as a result, everybody switched over to this. This was the brave new world of something radically new. Or was it? I mean, I think a lot of us in the period, the early years of the 21st century, have sometimes found ourselves wondering, what is the relationship between rhetoric and reality here? Hang on a minute, as Doctor Who might say. How much actually changed here, really? My inclination is to say that some things changed. There were some very interesting new dialogue-based initiatives, but actually quite a lot of what had been done under the banner of public understanding of science just got repackaged in the early 2000s as public engagement. So the question arises, well, what is engagement? And I'd like to suggest that one could be somewhat cynical, and one could imagine a kind of descending and increasingly cynical array of answers to that question. The first answer might be right on the high ground of principle. Maybe engagement is really about collaborative decision-making. Maybe we're trying to engage what Andrea in his work has called science citizens, people who are really engaged in science as members of a voting democracy. That's a high standard. Is that what we mean by engagement? Or is it something not quite so elevated as that? Is it simply something that creates a genuine meeting of minds, that those doing the work as science engagers end up in a situation where those they're engaging with really are sharing ideas and experiences? Or is it merely what we appear to be doing here this afternoon with the three of us up on this rather grand stage? Is it merely, as it were, a panel discussion? Does that count as engagement? You can see that this is getting more and more away from the high ground. Is it just a Q&A session? If you include an opportunity for the audience to ask a question, have you done a dialogue event? Is that really what it is? And weren't people having Q&A sessions long before the phrase engagement ever was used? And last but not least then, could you be really cynical and say, actually, has engagement just become another word for outreach? It's just the term we use for anything we do by way of an activity that connects science to larger publics. It seems to me that we have some real questions to answer there, maybe some questions to address in the course of this afternoon. You can ask an equally interesting array of questions about what engagement is for, and I see an equally wide range of implicit answers in the field. So there are folks in the world of formal education who quite comfortably use the word engagement for what they do. Is this an engaging educational experience? And here's a chart which maybe helps to define what in the context of formal education might be meant by science engagement. Is that what we mean? There are folks who still use the term more like I think some folks at the beginning intended it to be used when we're dealing with something that has more of a civic, more of a policy-oriented focus. Are we really trying to engage people in debates about important decisions to be made that affect them? Are we doing something that's in some sense emancipatory? In that case, we might be talking about a civic kind of engagement. There are people, I think, who want to use the word engagement who come from the world of public relations. They probably mean something quite different. Are we successfully getting our message across? Is that engagement? And then increasingly, and I think Peter may say a bit more about this momentarily, we have an increasingly rich array of experiences being offered in our culture for which the word engagement seems to be appropriate, but which are not really necessarily about formal conversation. They might be about a kind of shared cultural experience. Is that, perhaps, one of the meanings we should give to this term engagement? Oops. So, last in this little preliminary set of background comments and questions, what's the role of science centers in all of this ambiguity? And I'm just going to put up two very strikingly different word clouds that seem to me to capture two different spaces that can be occupied by science centers as I read it. Yes, oh no. I need to go back. There we are. So here's a word cloud, which is around that now so familiar acronym STEM, which seems to me mostly to be to do with the world of formal education. It's an area in which many science centers are very comfortable and are very active, in which case they may be thinking about engagement more in the educational sense that I used earlier. This one, perhaps, pretty straightforward. But there's another one, which is a word cloud of a quite different sort, which is about issues that aren't just necessarily of concern in the context of K-12 education. And the words include contentious, argumentative, scary, and you'll see the word engaging in there. So this is a very different area in which many, but perhaps not all science centers these days want to be involved or are involved, where we're trying to engage in larger debates which are relevant to the audiences we think we're serving. One question for me, and I think it's a big question, is what is the future for science centers in each of these two rather different and perhaps arguably equally important areas of public engagement? So that's all I'm going to do by way of a start. I'm now going to hand this magic device to Peter, who's going to take us on.
Thank you. You know, I think we're in territory where we're hung up on this phrase, public engagement. And I'm wondering what's going on in the minds of all of you sitting there, because I'm not sure that science centers are primarily in the business of that original definition of public engagement. Mutually informing two-way dialogues between scientists and the public about policy setting, research priorities, that sort of thing, STEM-related policy issues. Is that an oversimplification of the old definition that you're saying we've maybe shifted from?
No, I think it's fine.
So I want to push us outward a little bit toward more sort of cultural senses of the phrase public engagement, and I think then Andrea is going to bring us back to the science center world, though with an important twist. I think one of the ways that adults connect to science is indeed that sort of policy, participatory democracy sense, but there are also lots of other areas that you all represent and that are represented by our colleagues around the field. Science communication is over there, and informal science learning. There's science literacy, public understanding, public participation, and citizen science. All these sort of areas that have their own frameworks, their own language, their own picture of impact and causality, and importantly, their own communities, right? So there's the Science Writers Conference. There's a Science Media Conference that I was just at in Boston a few days ago, where there were very few museum people, perhaps not surprisingly. There are science festival conferences, et cetera. And so one thing we're seeing is sort of the balkanization of the discourse and, in some sense, practice, because no one seems to be looking at how science is connected to the broader culture, how it sits in contemporary culture. And I think that's important because, in some ways, it sets the conditions for all of the other outcomes and impacts that we're interested in. So you think about science literacy, a rational electorate, the STEM workforce pipeline, all of those things depend to some extent on how the biggest gears are turning with respect to the relationship between science as a whole set of practices and discourses and the broader culture. So if we miss a kind of cultural, if we fail to take a cultural look at science, I think we're missing the biggest gears in the machine. The trouble is, and I say that particularly to you all in the informal science learning world, that to get to that broader cultural focus, we kind of need to leave, not behind, but we need to sort of contextualize the learning and issue communication frame we have. And I want to share with you a quick slide about that. The utility frame is all those forms of sort of positive civic and policy outcomes, and it's generally seen through a learning lens. But it excludes a lot of important things that I'll show you some quick glimpses of and that are in your lives and you're well aware of. A lot of really influential things about science and culture. Those other things do become obvious, though, when we take a broader lens in which, as you'll see, the utility frame and the learning lens are embedded, a mainstreaming frame, and using a cultural lens on science. Because the mainstreaming of science in contemporary culture, I think, is what a lot of our most successful big picture practitioners are up to. And you indeed may, I'd like to hear in the Q&A whether you think that's what you're up to in your science centers too. To mainstream science, to normalize it as an everyday part of our culture, our entertainment, our social lives, our infospheres, right, where we get our daily content of various kinds. And that's why you find Neil deGrasse Tyson interviewing people like Whoopi Goldberg and Dan Savage and David Byrne and other sort of cultural folks in his podcast Star Talk, which is now also on National Geographic Channel as a television show. It's why at least Andrew and her whole IFL Science, actually one loses something, it's I fucking love science. That's the cultural flavor of it. She focuses on the lighter side of science and is trying to embed it in your daily Facebook feed. Guerrilla Science, a little organization in the UK that's doing fantastic work doing pop-up edgy
and in New York.
And that's right, they have an American presence, doing edgy interventions at big music festivals where millennials are hanging out and not thinking about science. Why Jan 11 is doing all kinds of work in the sort of arts and the arts incubator world in Brooklyn. She's curating a series there. And the Sloan Foundation, so far as I know, is the only foundation that has put as its sort of outward face around the science funding program a goal around funding things that embed and mainstream science in contemporary culture. Those practitioners, and there are many, many others, right? They're not trying to teach anybody anything particular. They're not trying to change your mind about an issue, a STEM-related issue. They're not trying to change your behavior generally. They're trying to embed science in your life. Okay, I made that point. So the point isn't to identify, in their view, it's not to identify as a scientist, as often we treat sort of visitors at science centers as mini curators or scientists in training. They're trying to help us identify as people who dig this kind of stuff in their daily lives. And that mainstreaming lens, I think, this broad lens, lets us see some things that we don't have a great framework for in other areas in the current discourse in science engagement, like where science meets comedy. This is Steve Cross from the UK, who runs a science show-off show, which is about training scientists in comedy techniques to loosen them up. And he's got a new podcast, Never Explaining. I mean, that alone says a great deal. Star Talk, which, as I mentioned, Neil Tyson works every episode with at least one comedian. And here you see Eugene Merman, second from left, very, very good sort of Brooklyn comedian who's comfortable in the science realm. Or think about what's going on in the UK. The parallel, Brian Cox, the darker-haired guy with the big teeth, is the equivalent in some sense of Brian Greene and Neil Tyson in the UK, and that's Robin Ince, a comedian who works with him on the Infinite Monkey Cage show. I'm just breezing through these, but think about where science meets entertainment as well. And when Interstellar came out, how it was used as a kind of platform or hook for a great deal of science communication work that was, quote, serious work. Kip Thorne, the physicist, was an advisor to the movie and also wrote this book, The Science of Interstellar. Or The Martian, right? You have Time Magazine and many, many other outlets taking an opportunity to build on the engagement, and it is public engagement in science, around Mars technology and planetary science and engineering, and to run infographics like this. Why would it be so hard to live on Mars? The Big Bang Theory is the most popular sitcom on television. It reaches, and I should have looked this up, it reaches audiences of millions. And these, in this photograph, are Feynman diagrams about particle interactions. Now you could ask, are they learning about Feynman diagrams in that show? The answer is no. But they're being connected to a form of science that is important and will show up for years and decades probably in the answers people give when they say in the future why they went into a certain field, as Star Trek did in the past. Or where science meets just hanging out with your friends, right? This is Nerd Night. It's in some 90 cities, I think, right now. Maybe you all know the statistic better. And you have things like Story Collider, which you mentioned, John. Science meets the storytelling revival, a la The Moth. This is about personal exposure, but it's still about science. And then, one of my favorite examples is where science meets a form of mystery and uncertainty and sort of personal, very highly idiosyncratic and individual meaning making in Radiolab. Radiolab, in my view, is a place where science shows, science media is celebrating what we don't know and where the edges of certainty blur off into, supposition and doubt. Look, we don't have time for a full argument about it, but I want to make one more quick point before I hand this to Andrea, which is that it's not just happening, all these things, in public engagement with science. It's happening in public engagement with almost bloody everything. So if you look at journalism, for example, political journalism, this is the Slate Political Gabfest. This is the inverse of most shows. It's exactly what's put on the air in this podcast and in their live shows is exactly what has been edited out for decades in political commentary and journalism. They chat with each other, they argue, they're friends, they have personal opinions, and it's fantastic listening. It's the ultimate dorm room session, but much more well-grounded, in fact. Or you think about the ways that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert have reshaped politics as comedy, or comedy as politics. Very hard to make a distinction. And I just want to point out that Bill Maher does the traditional stand-up in his HBO show that is, the comedy that you might have seen 20 years ago on television. But on the right, we see the panel discussion, which is folks from think tanks and folks from Capitol Hill. And it is very deep, rich, and lively and personable discourse around politics. So a show like Johnny Carson in the past, where those things would never have happened in the same place, is now being remixed and mashed up in ways that are really important. It's happening in classical music. This is Classical Revolution, a network in, I think, 40 cities in the US and a few in Europe. Very informal jam sessions among classical musicians in bars, pubs, coffee shops. You can see the sort of deformalization of culture here, and I'll get to some of the ideas about what's actually going on. The Chicago Symphony and many other orchestras that we work with have done projects with DJs, and this is Mason Bates. He's a DJ / composer in residence. Again, unthinkable in recent years, a few years ago. Or if you just think about the food truck culture and how the attention in culinary circles has moved from fine dining tablecloth sorts of restaurants to places where the chefs have large Twitter followings and will get those Twitter followings to come to them on a street corner in a given city where they travel. Or history of all buttoned down sort of stuffy subjects. You have drunk history, you have drunk Shakespeare. There is a shift in the culture that is paralleled in a lot of what we've just been talking about in science. Sarah Vowell on the right there is doing a very different kind of history than her predecessors, David McCullough. And McCullough was never an academic historian, but think about how much more, if you read Sarah Vowell, you get to know about Sarah Vowell than you ever do reading David McCullough, get to know about David McCullough. There's a presence that she has in the story, both in the literal tale of her own research, but also, very importantly, her sensibility and her wit and her sassiness. She calls herself a historian-adjacent, nonfiction wise guy. And that's a form of mediation that I think is hugely important. Okay, so I think we can put our fingers on these shifts and call one of them, at least, explaining or presenting, moving to something about engaging. Explaining is sort of an objective phenomenon, right? You're talking about something outside of yourself. But engaging is sort of sharing, right? You're sharing something presentationally the way an artist might. A move from edifying and illuminating some subject to expressing and sharing on your own. I think those are highly overlapping. From serious and reverent, we've seen examples of this, right? To funny and irreverent. From rational to emotional or creative. And especially important, I think, objective to subjective, where the personal experience of the scientist or the science communicator is as important to the experience of the public in that moment as the objective facts about the way the world works that he or she is engaged in. And from narrative to story. And I think that's a distinction that museums maybe could stand to talk about. A narrative has a beginning, middle, and an end. But it's not a story until it's me telling you something, or you telling me a story, something that happened to you that was transformative. So personal experience has become more important. And I think finally, science has moved, as many other cultural domains that we've been looking at, from a distinct realm in its own, with this safe kind of tidy category, to an embedded place in culture, which is messy with respect to categories and porous with respect to boundaries. I'm summarizing what I've given, as a longer set of ideas in other settings, but I hope this is at least helpful to what we're doing here.
Thank you, Peter. Now, Andrea, over to you.
Thank you. So, and in the past, in the past few weeks and months, we've been having a couple of conversations with Peter and John and Walter, thinking about public engagement, and then I tried to distill this conversation with my own experience, and I came to a list of 7 items that I'm going to give to you. And then this morning I realized it looks like the list of the 7 deadly sins of science centers. That's not how I wanted to be remembered, but so here they are. So the first one is we should really be clear what we as science centers get from public engagement. If it's a two-way communication, the accent is always on what people learn, and very almost never about what we learn. And I don't mean only doing the evaluation to know if the public learned or was transformed by the experience, but really getting that knowledge that resides with the public and that can transform our own way of doing things, or even indeed impact policy or impact our practice. And when I was doing my research, I studied how, for instance, patients associations or volunteers and activists in the medical environmental field talk about public engagement, and there is an enormous field of academic literature about public engagement with science from that perspective. And there, actually, the situation is just the opposite. It is the researchers, it is the organizations that do public engagement because they want to learn from the public. And I think that is very, in our field, that's still at its infancy. We really don't design the process of public engagement with the learning from the public to us in mind. And therefore it's so easy to revert to more classical formats of doing outreach and doing one-way communication, and thinking public engagement is another way to do learning and education. The second point, slightly related, is that public engagement with science is not only with the audience, but it's also with the researchers, with the scientists. And again, many of the activities that we do not have a structural connection with the scientist. It is either project-based, so it works until the project is funded. It is topical, so it is with a specific, for a specific field. But very rarely the institution is structurally connected with the university or a research center or another place of knowledge. So that in the long term, it can actually change the practice of doing research. And we've seen that among others also in Science Gallery, how doing public engagement in a constant structural way changes completely the way of doing research. The researchers, the scientists, get new questions. They learn how to expand their research. They learn also how to interrogate their own process in different ways, to make their own students more enthusiastic. So it is a very deep and beneficial aspect on their practice. And again, we often forget that public engagement is actually a multi-stakeholder process, and we should be well aware of what are the consequences for all the stakeholders. The third point, well, John mentioned before that the definition of engagement is maybe vague, but probably even more vague is the definition of the public. There isn't a public, there are indeed different publics, but more and more the public is really defined by the issue. So even our categories to define the public, age, level of education, socioeconomic descriptors and so on, are becoming really very weak, because the public that aggregates around issues is very transversal, and it doesn't fit anymore in those categories that are used. So there is I think an enormous work to be done there, and maybe public engagement is becoming, well, it blurs into a personal engagement with science that is done in a social context, and therefore indeed it really creates a problem if it's not approached in this way. The fourth point is actually there is a very solid body of literature about public engagement, and I'm speaking mostly about the academic literature, peer-reviewed articles, and if you look really in the specific field of public engagement, museums and science centers are almost invisible. The main journals of science communication and public engagement, the Public Understanding of Science, Science Communication, Science and Technology and Social Issues. In the past 20 years, Public Engagement of Science published 465 articles, and 13 were about science museums and science centers. And science communication even less. So, and I think this is, on the one hand, of course, museums and science centers, museums doing research, maybe it's not their first mandate, and of course it takes effort and resources to do research, but there is a consequence to this problem, is that the field is largely ignored by all the other players that publish the other 421 articles. And I think this is really creating a problem, because, and I'll come back to that in, I think, my fifth deadly sin. There is a problem of being recognized by the stakeholder outside, and even if there is an effort then to shape and design public engagement initiatives in our field to have an impact, for instance, in policy or in larger practices or in a larger social context, we have to face the fact that our field is not so well known for what it can bring to the table, because it doesn't participate in the same way as other actors in these avenues. And of course, I mean, the academic literature is by no means the only way of doing this. But I think there is a very big imbalance between what museums and science centers publish in the field of education and what they do in the field of public engagement. Personally, I think that they could do a bit more in the field of public engagement and not focus only on education. So the fifth one is probably going to be painful, but I think that our field is very self-referring, and there is little space for voices from outside to be heard. The conferences of our field are dominated by participants from our field, and on the one hand, of course, it is the Conference of Science Centers, and I'm speaking of all the conferences, not only this one. But I think really specific efforts should be done to bring voices that can offer a critical point of view about what we do. It is healthy. It's not. It is really. It's way too easy to give the pat on the shoulder and tell each other that we are doing well, because we do, but we need that critical assessment from outside. It is beneficial to hear from those stakeholders, those participants that ignore science centers, why they are ignored. I think we are also in a very strong position now to be able to have that kind of confrontation. So I would advocate to really put an effort to include voices from outside, which is difficult because because of indeed the fact that in many other fields science centers are not well known or ignored. It's difficult to bring those people to the conversations, but it's really very, very beneficial. In Europe, slowly this is happening also through the European projects that try to get multiple and different actors together. The weakness is that it is done on a project based, so it is short term. And the last two are actually results from my study, where I studied the scientific citizenship in science centers in Europe. And I just give you two results, which are really very interesting, and I still don't know exactly the cause of that, but The first one is that there is a inverse correlation between the level of education of the public and their interest to participate in discussion and debates in science centers. So the more people are educated, the more they are also engaged in science outside of the science center, and the less they are interested to do that in the science center. Which is, so there are two ways of looking at that. You know, the negative side is that it's worrisome because it means that the more people are educated, the less they believe that science centers are places for discussion and debates. The positive side is that science centers have really a democratizing role for people with lower education because they are really very interested and they see the science center as a place that where for many people with lower education, the science center probably is the only place where they can have those kind of discussions. But indeed, we have to take consideration of the difference in the social and education level of the public. And the other result is that there is a positive and measurable effect between the perception of the public that the science center plays a role in public policy and their interest to participate in discussions. Which means that the more the public is aware or think that the science center plays a role in shaping public policy on the issues that they deal with, the more the public is interested to participate in those discussions and conversations. And the opposite is also true, that the less that awareness is there, the less and the weaker is the interest to participate. And I think that also speaks I look at this from an optimistic point of view. It encourages to be more open and clear about the fact that science centers can have this role in policy. And I would even push it to the fact that science centers shouldn't shy away from saying that they have a political role. Political in the sense really of defining the kind of society we want to live in. That's the definition of politics. And we know that that really encourages people to participate in those discussions. So that was the seventh point, and that's indeed, I now leave this as stimulus for conversations and for questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you to both of our speakers. I'm just going to ask them both a question, and then I want to open it up to the floor. My question relates back to something that Bud Rock said when he introduced us all. We're guests here in a certain sense on this stage, but he suggested that these Alan Friedman dialogues are intended to raise issues which can be implicitly or explicitly critical. And I've heard a number of, I think you've been, I might almost say as a person born in England, you've been rather English, rather British about the way you've done it. You've been very polite. And, but in the course of what you both said, there are some either implicit or partly explicit criticisms of the way that science museums and science centers are going about their work. And I wonder if I can encourage you briefly to, here's an audience of folk, most of us work in museums or science centers, I'm assuming. If you had just one or two recommendations for how to do things differently, what would they be? Peter.
I'm trying to, actually, can I pass it to him? Because I'll answer it. You've been doing, you didn't take any credit in this little 10 minutes of your fame of the work that you're doing at Science Gallery and the fact that it is really different from the tradition of sort of didactic, fun, family-oriented exhibits, mostly for kids and families.
Yeah, well, Science Gallery indeed is a place where the target audience is 15 to 25, so it's the young adults. And, and it is indeed very different probably from other places because the fact of having that audience and being connected, actually being part of the university, means that the public engagement is really a system that engages the students, the faculty of the university and the entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial life of the city. One way, I think, I was looking at the topics of the programs of Science Gallery, and actually 2/3 are really very serious stuff. It's trauma, blood, infection, collapse. The show opening next week is called Design and Violence, and it's a co-production with MoMA actually, about the use of design for violent and aggressive and political reasons. And that's the thing that really gets young people, because it is being serious. And then 1/3 is also more lightweight and more optimistic topics. But it's really very engaging to discuss about the real, the stuff that is really around us. And if my encouragement would be, indeed, be serious. Don't be scared about doing things that are tough, because then is the threshold for young people to be engaged and really participate and tell how they feel and how they can contribute will come up. If we do fun and entertaining and kind of predictable, optimistic visions of science in the future, there's not much to contribute.
Yeah, and I would just generalize from that answer and say, that science centers and all the cultural and informal learning organizations that I and my colleagues work with, they were rooted in the 20th century, in some cases even the 19th century, and they're really good at the stuff that I'm going to borrow back to my slide here since it's still up, on that traditional sort of 20th century left side of your screen. They're great at it. That's what they were born doing. But if you think about a shift from rational to more emotional in a science center, it's hard to, I know that it's part of the discourse, and you guys talk about the affective components of learning, and that's part of the way you think about exhibit design and programming, but it's really not there yet. I mean, that's as critical as I think a thought as I would offer on that particular line item, right?
Okay.
I think and I said the same about story. I mean, we're great at the narratives, less good at the personal, subjective, lived experience. What is it like to be a scientist? And what is it like to be this museum as an institution or people telling you a story?
Okay, last thing that we're going to put on the screen. Here are some dimensions that we thought when we were planning this session were perhaps important dimensions for the kind of discussion we're hoping to have. We have this issue that I think both of the other colleagues here on the stage have raised about the relationship between science and the wider culture in which it's embedded. How far are we contributing to this notion, accidentally perhaps, unintentionally, that science is a thing unto itself, something separate? We have obviously the enduring question of the relationship between people who are in the world of science or in the world of science presentation and the communities, the different communities. Andrea encouraged us to think about specific kinds of publics that we might be trying to engage who are in some sense outside those communities. We have a question, again, I think both of my two colleagues here have really focused on a question about the relationship between the Science Center world itself and other providers and platforms, people who are busy trying to engage audiences but don't do it through the kinds of institutions that we work in. How much of a relationship do we have with those folks? What sorts of relationships might we have? And something that's implicit in a lot of what we've done, Andrea has just pointed it out by reference to Science Gallery International. I mean, the fact is, I think most science museums and science centers have a characteristic demographic. The place I first worked in, which was the Science Museum London, used to call itself the 3 visits in a lifetime museum. You went when you were 8, you went when your kids were 8, and you went when your grandkids were 8. And what that meant was there was a great dip in the demographic profile of people coming in, and that was a dip in older teenagers and young adults. And guess where Science Gallery International is positioning itself? It's positioning itself right in that hole. So how interesting is that? So what's the relationship between what we do for students and children and younger visitors and what we do with a more adult focus? So those are just some dimensions we're offering. Now, this is where you have to get to do some work. So it's very important for the next little piece that anyone who's sitting at a table on their own, unless you want to have a conversation with yourself, you should get into a table with some other folks. And what we thought we might do just for a couple of minutes, if you'd be willing to have focused conversation within the table. This is, after all, a session about engagement. So guess what? If we were to sit up here and just talk with you for an hour and a quarter, even we would realize the irony of that. So we'd like you to just brainstorm a little bit amongst yourselves the various ideas that have been put out here, and then we'll not do that for too long. We'll come back into plenary, and we're hoping that tables will then come up with the most salient or interesting question that you have, not just for us, because guess what? We're not the fountains of all wisdom, but questions for the sector, for the field, for all of us. So let's just give ourselves 3 minutes for a really intensive brainstorm, and out of that we want your table to come up with a candidate question for us all. Provocative as you like, be as brief as you like, make sure there's a question mark on the end of what you say. Who's first? Please.
Is this on?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I can do provocative. So on the last slide you had up before this one, the green one, you sort of had it on the left side, there it is, on the left side traditional, on the right emerging, and you defined engagement as being more to the right and being towards the emerging was good, and your main criticisms of science centers were that we didn't do enough of the emerging. Well, I'm going to propose that that is 100% wrong only because it's mathematically impossible to be more than 100% wrong. Let's look at what's on the right there. It's moving from rational and objective to emotional and subjective. That's what Stephen Colbert defined as truthiness. Just to give a few examples, that's why if someone sees a tweet that, say, a presidential candidate puts out that has racist crime statistics that are certainly wrong, but they feel they're correct, then we treat both of the things as equally valid points of view. That's why we look at, say, things moving from serious to irreverent, that we have to depend on comedians like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert to actually get actual news. That's why if you pulled up CNN's website today, there's nothing about...
I hope you're going to put a question mark on this quite soon.
I am, yes. So, you know, the things on the right there, they certainly appear to be saying, personal opinion equals fact.
Yeah, no,
why would we want to do engagement if it's going to blur the line to that point?
Okay,
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
A real quick answer. I don't think subjective is the same thing as truthy or dodgy logically. I think it's about what the facts mean to the scientist or to the communicator. And that's an interest that I think culture is moving toward, not away from, and that on the right side of the spectrum, these spectra are things that are just becoming more relevant. Now, I don't mean to say that science centers are wrong to not be doing them. I actually empathize with the managers of all these cultural and informal learning institutions that have expertise on the left side of this, but are being asked by the ways culture, broadly speaking, is evolving to get good at some of these other things. I disagree with you about the facts. Now, in terms of science as a discipline, rational, objective, all of that is hugely important, but science engagement doesn't work purely as science. It works as a cultural phenomenon, and these things on the right are signifiers of relevance and places in which innovation is occurring. Without them, we don't stand a chance of being relevant.
Okay, I want to move on to another table, preferably on this side. There's a hand right in the back. Go for it.
Hi, John. It's Julie.
Oh, hi, Julie.
Hey.
Sorry.
So we were talking a little bit about being too insular, too inward-facing, and so our table kind of came up with the question of how do we get over ourselves and come to this understanding as institutions, organizations, and go out there and, learn.
That's a really good question, I think. How do we get over ourselves? I mean, maybe we should spend a little longer attending other sectors' meetings than perhaps some of us do. Maybe we should, you've been very gracious, by the way, Aztec has been very gracious to invite us, and Peter himself, I think, you probably never worked professionally in a science center.
Sure.
So, we're doing some of the bringing of other people in here. Maybe we should do a bit more of it, is I guess what I'm hearing. Let's keep going, please, because there's so many tables. And yes, you've got a hand down in front here. Sorry, that's... Oh, all right. Okay, Walter. I always defer to Walter Stabler.
quick question. So back to the green slide, I agree with your comments. That's a shifting culture that we need to recognize and think about how we position ourselves in that new culture. Could you switch back to the
Yes.
slide? I just want to say that I think that I'm not so sure I agree that we're so great at stuff on the left to begin with, but I do agree that we need to really think about who we are in the world, in this other world. My question is, you talked about diversifying age range, not necessarily about if we can really respond to that new world, will we actually see it? Will we be working with different groups of publics? And I know, Andrea, you guys are specifically targeting an age range, but I'm talking about all kinds of different publics. And what do you think we need to do, and is this maybe an opportunity for us to think about that?
Thank you. By the way, we don't have to reply to everything on the stage. That's a false kind of Q&A type thing, so we want to always keep coming back. So there was somebody here. Yes, please. And you could, by the way, respond to each other if you want.
I don't have a response, but I do want to say that one of the reasons that I was drawn to this field to begin with was because I felt that more formal methods of education weren't really didn't really have the opportunity to reach families and more underrepresented audiences. And I feel like part of what that shift might indicate is that we have to begin to think about how we relate to different groups more in a cultural way that is more understandable and more relatable to them than the more like didactic or more traditional ways of relating. So I think that relevance, I think that is really important, and also just being able to give the opportunity for parents to understand, parents from many immigrant communities to understand the content in the ways that they are able to understand it, and in the ways that they're more receptive to understanding it.
Thank you. More tables, yes, right in the middle here. You can fight over who gets the mic to him first.
How do we talk about relevancy, and we've always talked about relevancy. How do we ask for relevancy from our audience? And then after we ask, who decides what is the best thing to be relevant?
Wow. Do you feel, can I just come back to you, do you feel that we don't put enough responsibility sometimes on the audiences we serve? Are you implying that?
Well, I want to attract the audience, and I want them to realize that the reason why I am trying to attract them to is things that are totally relevant to their lives.
Right.
The resources that we all need to live. What's universal for humans to have, all of us to have a great life.
I was very struck by Andrea's rhetorical question, because it's one that I haven't spent enough time thinking about. What is it that we, now thinking of us as professionals in museums and science centers, what do we hope to learn from the audiences that come in? And I suspect that sometimes that's not really very much up in our minds. We're just thinking about how they'll benefit and whether they will go out with a better understanding or whatever. But the notion that we might go away having benefited from the exchange, I think is a really salutary one.
There's also a quick, important answer perhaps around pleasure, which is that people go to these cultural events, and including the non-science ones I showed, for a form of pleasurable engagement, right? And I think that unless we offer that as I said earlier, the precursor to the kinds of outcomes that you're interested in and the kinds of sort of policy awareness and engagement that I think perhaps is the end point of all of this, we're lost. If it's not pleasurable, this is informal science learning, right? This is free choice, as John Falk put it years ago. I mean, if they're not choosing freely, then none of the rest of it matters.
Okay, other tables, there's lots. Yes, please.
Pardon me. Our table was asking, how do you make money with engaging adults? Does it have to be kind of a sensationalist exhibit, and maybe more importantly, how do you convince your board that you can make money, making that shift from families and youth to adults and teens?
It is true, isn't it, that in my experience, some of the biggest volume activities in science museums and centers are family-oriented events, and some of your adult events are sometimes smaller numbers, and I guess that can be an economic issue. But it's an issue, isn't it, that applies to all of the educational work we do. How do we fund it, I guess? What about, do other people have responses to this question? How do you make it pay, this kind of work that we're talking about? Yeah, please. There's a mic right just behind Walt here.
We make our adult events, which are once a month, extremely fun, and we have pizza and alcoholic beverages. And we make lots of money because all the vendors donate back to us for each unit that they sell. And we used to get, when they weren't quite as pizza-y and fun, we used to get 100 people, and we'll probably break 1,000 in our event this Thursday. $5 a head to get in is cheap, adds up quickly.
So the answer to how you make money, apparently, folks, is pizza and pints. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. Bonzi, for instance, has an after dark program of 2,000 people who are between the ages of 20 and 40. But that wasn't my question. There's 32 million people in the United States who are illiterate now. 25%, 25 to 30%, some places 50% dropout rates in high school. These people, politically, I'm going to go out on a limb here saying, are some of the people who are listening to the sound bites that politicians are saying today. They are not listening to reason, they're not interested in science, they don't understand even why it's important. I'm just concerned that those are the people that we really need to figure out how to reach and what do we do about it.
I couldn't agree more, and I think one of the things we need in this field is a very broad population level look at who's participating and in what ways, and what's working, whether it's this new stuff or the old stuff, and what's not, and for whom, right? And how these emerging strategies, if at all, can be applied to new forms of programming that are going to reach new underserved audiences, and underserved not just ethnically, as you say, but socioeconomically and educationally.
We began the discussion at our table with the thought that we have whole lives. We don't have lives that are divided into science and arts and other kinds of divisions. So if we can start being more inclusive in the kinds of offerings that we have that feed all these sides, I think we'll start attracting more of a diverse dialogue and attendance that we're hoping to see. And my thought is, we've got to look for partners apart from who we normally look for in partners. We tend to look at partners that look like us or sort of look like us, and I'm guilty of it too, other museums, nature centers, but there's lots of other partnerships out there, and then you'll begin to have that broader experience to offer.
That's a nice answer to the question that was posed earlier here, thank you.
Now, we have I'm not speaking politically here, but we have an enormous right wing over there, which has not really contributed yet, so we want some hands from over there. Or if you're sitting at the back and looking forward, it's an enormous left wing, actually. So whichever you like. There's one down the front here. Oh, right there, I'm sorry.
I hope you don't interpret my message as a right-hand message. Just the opposite. In my museum, we receive 85% of our audience ranging between 15 and 25 years old. And I think that it's because we just didn't think about the divide if we are for children or not, and because we're not trying to entertain with our messages. We are trying to deliver messages that people care about. And I think that the only way to do that is if, while designing, instead of just shopping for things that are flashy and may bring audiences, if you design thinking that you have to research what are the topics that are interesting for your community or the people you're going to serve, and you try to put those messages in the language they want, they will come to the place. And honestly, I think it's a big, big commitment we have to take away this idea that science communication is for children.
Yeah.
I think science communication is for society.
Yeah.
Society has all sorts of ages.
Which museum you are? You're being asked to sell yourself. What's your museum?
I hate to do that because I need to make explanations. My museum is the Interactive Museum of Economics, and we are devoted to economy and sustainability. So we talk to all sorts of audiences.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes.
In Mexico.
We have about 5 minutes now, so we want to get around as many voices as we can in that short time. Over on the right here, so yes, please. Walter, right in front of you, I think. And then further back. Oh yeah, next time from the mic at the back, yeah. Go.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of North American metropolitan science centre dialogue. I'm from a very different country where we don't have, our nearest science centre, International Science Centre, is about 5 hours away. So we connect with all sorts of different organisations. So my thought about this is you also need connected and unconnected, or unconnected going to connected, because picking up the point over here about reaching out to different types of organisations, that's what we have to do, and that's what a lot of organisations are doing. Also, there's no one science centre model. You don't recognise the diversity within an individual science centre. And the question I'd ask is, what about context? Because again, you're giving a general metropolitan context, whereas I think context varies and defines more about what the outcome is.
Thank you. 2 minutes now. I'm going to. Yeah, one in the back. I promise. Yes.
So we have an example of cafes that we've had. One we had on Zika, and we barely got anybody coming in to see that. Very, very low. We did another one that was on dog cognition, and it was standing room only. We actually had to open up a whole new area at the museum to accommodate.
Can I ask where you did that?
That was in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay.
So the issue is being relevant. How more relevant can you be than right in this day and age talking about Zika, low turnout, and then something that is pretty perennial, how smart your dog is, and conquering hordes come through the door. So,
go on, Peter.
I would just love to de-yoke the content from the experience a little bit and say that people come sometimes for what they know will be a great experience, whether or not they have a pre-existing affiliation or connection to that content here. I mean, when you go to some of these events, Nerd Night is a classic example, you don't know what they're going to talk about, and that's not why you're there. You're there for a great experience. I don't know how your Zika experience and your dog experience differs, but people are used to seeing science centers in terms of content because, frankly, they know pretty much what the experience will be outside that content.
I think we've got time for one more comment from the floor. Please, who's it going to be? Yes, you got it.
I have a question that has to do about control. I really think that this is a control issue, and until we can let go of control and let people use our institutions for what they want to use our institutions for, and we provide a service, a lot of those things won't be accomplished. So my question is, how do we get over the obstacles to letting go of control?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it probably has something to do with a certain kind of self-confidence, and whereas if you're not too confident, then planning everything and controlling everything seems to be the way to go. And I think it's a brilliant idea to try and loosen up and give other people the chance to do their thing in your space. So we have to stop. I hear a lot to do with connection and how more connection is a good thing, and that's how I was going to finish, but I'd like to just throw in a word now for maybe less control sometimes would also be great. Thanks to the panelists, thanks to Bud, thank you to you all.